Marcus Chen stood in the bathroom mirror at 5:47 a.m., water dripping from his face as he stared at the reflection he barely recognized anymore. 6 months ago, this same mirror had shown him a different man entirely. A man who flinched when his boss raised his voice. A man who apologized for existing. A man whose girlfriend had walked away because, as she put it, "I can't love someone who doesn't even love himself." The transformation hadn't been sudden. It had been forged in the crucible of daily decisions, each one seemingly small, each one building upon the last like sedimentary layers of stone that eventually become mountains. The journey began on a Tuesday morning in March when Marcus found himself standing outside the conference room where his entire team was discussing the Peterson project. Through the glass wall, he could see his colleague James presenting the ideas Marcus had developed over 3 sleepless weeks. James gestured enthusiastically at the charts and graphs that represented Marcus's late nights and early mornings, his research and innovation. Marcus's hand touched the door handle 3 times before pulling away. His throat felt tight, his palms damp. The familiar voice in his head whispered its usual poison, "Don't make waves. They'll think you're difficult. Just let it go. It's not worth the confrontation." But something different happened that day. Instead of walking away as he had countless times before, Marcus forced himself to count to 10. In those 10 seconds, he pictured himself at 70, looking back at this moment. The old man in his imagination wasn't proud of the young man who walked away. The old man was disappointed, tired of a lifetime of surrendered moments. Marcus pushed open the door. "Excuse me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The room turned toward him. 12 faces expressing varying degrees of surprise and mild annoyance at the interruption. "I believe there's been some confusion about the Peterson project." The words felt foreign in his mouth, like speaking a language he'd studied but never practiced. James's face flushed red. "Mr. Harrison," the department head raised an eyebrow. "Marcus, we're in the middle of a presentation here." "I understand, sir, but the ideas being presented are mine. I had the original documentation, time-stamped emails and draft materials dating back 3 weeks." The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Marcus's heart hammered so hard he was certain everyone could hear it, but he didn't back down. He didn't apologize. He simply stood there, holding his ground like a tree planted in good soil. What followed was uncomfortable. James sputtered explanations and half-truths. Mr. Harrison asked questions. Marcus provided answers with documentation. The truth, as truth often does, eventually surfaced. But the real transformation didn't happen in that moment of vindication. It happened in the hours that followed, when Marcus realized the world hadn't ended. He hadn't been fired. The sky hadn't fallen. Instead, people looked at him differently, with a new kind of respect. That evening, Marcus sat in his small apartment and did something he hadn't done in months. He ordered pizza without apologizing to the delivery driver for bothering him. He called his mother without preparing excuses for why he hadn't called sooner. He looked at himself in the mirror and nodded once, a small gesture of acknowledgement from one version of himself to another. The Peterson incident became what Marcus would later call day 1 of his reconstruction. Day 2 came when he decided to join a boxing gym. Marcus had always been physically small, but more than that, he had been mentally small. He carried himself like someone apologizing for taking up space. At Mendez Boxing Gym, surrounded by men and women who moved through the world with purpose and power, Marcus felt like an imposter. "You ever been hit in the face?" asked Tony Mendez, the gym's owner, a weathered man in his 50s whose hands looked like they'd been carved from oak. "Not intentionally," Marcus replied. Tony laughed, not unkindly. "Today we change that." The first time Marcus stepped into the ring for sparring, he lasted exactly 43 seconds before finding himself on his back, staring at the fluorescent lights. His opponent, a woman named Carmen, who couldn't have weighed more than 130, stood over him with her glove extended to help him up. "Rule number 1, she said as she pulled him to his feet. "Getting knocked down ain't the failure. Staying down is." Marcus got back up. He got knocked down again and again. But each time, he rose a little faster, learned a little more, absorbed the lesson that pain was temporary, but quitting was permanent. After 3 weeks of consistent punishment, something shifted. Marcus began to anticipate punches before they landed. He started throwing combinations that actually connected. More importantly, he stopped flinching at life outside the gym. When his landlord tried to raise his rent illegally, Marcus didn't just pay it. He researched tenant laws, prepared documentation, and negotiated from a position of knowledge and strength. When a waiter brought him the wrong order at a restaurant, he politely but firmly asked for what he had actually ordered, instead of eating food he didn't want while leaving a tip for service he didn't receive. The physical training was reshaping his mental architecture. Every morning at 5:30 a.m., when his alarm went off and his body screamed for more sleep, Marcus chose discipline over comfort. Every evening, when his muscles ached and his mind urged him to skip the gym, he chose growth over stagnation. The woman who would later become his wife first noticed him during week 7 of his transformation. Dr. Sarah Mitchell was finishing her residency at St. Mary's Hospital when she literally ran into Marcus outside the gym. She was rushing from her car, late for a morning run, when she collided with someone carrying boxing gloves and a gym bag. "I'm so sorry," she began, but stopped when she looked up into Marcus's eyes. There was something there she didn't expect, a quiet confidence that seemed newly earned. "No problem at all," Marcus replied, and meant it. 6 months earlier, he would have apologized profusely, gathered her scattered belongings while making self-deprecating jokes, and walked away feeling like he'd ruined someone's day. Instead, he helped her up, made sure she was okay, and introduced himself. "You box?" Sarah asked, noticing his gear. "I learned to stand up," Marcus replied. It was an odd way to phrase it, but something in his tone made her understand he wasn't just talking about boxing. Their first conversation lasted 20 minutes in a parking lot at 6:15 a.m. Sarah found herself fascinated by this man who spoke about personal growth the way other people discussed the weather, not as some extraordinary achievement, but as a natural, necessary part of existence. "Most people I know are afraid of change," she told him. "They talk about wanting to improve their lives, but never actually do anything different." "Change is uncomfortable," Marcus agreed. "But staying the same when you know you could be better is agony." Sarah had dated doctors, lawyers, and successful businessmen. She had never been more attracted to someone than she was to this man who had clearly fought for every ounce of confidence he possessed. They began running together in the mornings before her shifts and his work. During these runs, Marcus shared his story, not the sanitized version he might have told months earlier, but the real story. The years of backing down, giving in, and disappearing into the background of his own life. "What changed?" Sarah asked during one of their runs through the park. "I got tired of being a supporting character in my own story," Marcus replied. "I realized that every day I chose to stay weak, I was choosing to stay miserable." Sarah had grown up as the daughter of a successful surgeon and a prominent attorney. She had been raised in an environment of achievement and high expectations. She had dated men who projected strength but had never known the effort it cost them because it had come naturally. There was something profoundly attractive about Marcus's earned confidence, his deliberate strength. "You know what I find most impressive about you?" she said one morning as they finished their run. "What's that?" "You're not trying to convince anyone you're strong. You're just being strong." The distinction mattered more than Marcus initially realized. His transformation wasn't performative. He wasn't lifting weights to impress people or speaking up in meetings to be noticed. He was rebuilding himself for himself, and the external changes were simply byproducts of internal reconstruction. By month 4 of his journey, Marcus's colleagues began seeking his input on projects. His opinions carried weight because he had learned to research thoroughly before speaking and to speak with conviction when he did. His boss, Mr. Harrison, started assigning him more challenging projects. "Chen, I want you to lead the Williams account," Harrison announced during a Monday morning meeting. "It's our biggest client and they've specifically requested someone with fresh perspectives." 6 months earlier, Marcus would have panicked at the responsibility. He would have spent sleepless nights worried about failing, about disappointing people, about proving he wasn't worthy of the trust. Instead, he accepted the assignment with quiet confidence and immediately began planning his approach. The Williams account required Marcus to manage a team of 8 people, several of whom had more experience than he did. In the old days, this would have paralyzed him. How could he lead people who knew more than he did? How could he make decisions when others might disagree? But boxing had taught him something valuable. You don't have to be the strongest person in the room to be the most effective. You just have to be willing to take the hits that come with responsibility and keep moving forward. Marcus's leadership style developed organically. He didn't try to dominate or intimidate. Instead, he listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and made decisions based on logic rather than ego. When team members disagreed with his direction, he welcomed their input and adjusted his approach when they made better arguments. You know what's different about working with Marcus? His teammate Jennifer told another colleague over lunch. He's not trying to prove anything. He just wants to get the job done right. The Williams account became the department's most successful project that quarter. But more importantly for Marcus, it proved to himself that leadership wasn't about being the loudest or most aggressive person in the room. It was about taking responsibility, making thoughtful decisions, and maintaining composure under pressure. Sarah watched this evolution with growing admiration and something deeper. She had initially been attracted to Marcus's determination to improve himself, but as weeks turned into months, she found herself falling in love with the man he was becoming. "You're different from anyone I've ever dated," she told him one evening as they shared dinner at a small restaurant. "How so?" "The men I usually date, they're successful, but their success feels inherited somehow. Like they were born with advantages and just maintained them. With you, I can see the work. I can see the choices you make every day to be better than you were yesterday." Marcus considered this. "Maybe that's because I started from a place where the only direction was up." "No," Sarah said, shaking her head. "I know plenty of people who started from difficult places and used that as an excuse to stay stuck. You chose to use your weakness as raw material for strength." That night, Marcus looked at himself in the bathroom mirror again. The face looking back was fundamentally the same, but everything about it had changed. His posture was straighter. His eyes held contact instead of darting away. His jaw was set with quiet determination rather than clenched with anxiety. The physical changes were obvious. Months of boxing and disciplined eating had added muscle and reduced fat, but the deeper changes were more profound. Marcus no longer moved through the world like someone expecting to be rejected. He carried himself like someone who belonged wherever he chose to be. More importantly, he had learned to distinguish between confidence and arrogance. Arrogance was loud and brittle, designed to mask insecurity. Confidence was quiet and flexible, rooted in genuine competence and self-knowledge. At the 6-month mark of his transformation, Marcus received an unexpected phone call from James, the colleague who had tried to steal credit for the Peterson project. "Marcus, I owe you an apology," James said, his voice carrying a weight that suggested this wasn't an easy call to make. "What I did was wrong, and I've been thinking about it for months." Marcus listened without interrupting. "The thing is," James continued, "watching how you handled that situation, and how you've carried yourself since then, it made me realize something about myself. I took credit for your work because I was afraid mine wasn't good enough. You standing up for yourself forced me to confront the fact that I've been operating from fear instead of integrity." "What are you going to do about that?" Marcus asked. "I'm starting therapy, and I wanted to ask you something. Would you be willing to get coffee sometime? I'd like to understand how you developed the courage to change." The conversation lasted an hour. Marcus shared what he had learned. That transformation wasn't a single dramatic moment, but a series of small daily choices. That strength wasn't about never being afraid, but about acting correctly despite fear. That confidence came from competence, and competence came from consistent practice. The hardest part, Marcus explained, was accepting that I had spent years choosing to be weak. Once I took responsibility for that choice, I could start making different choices. James listened intently, taking notes like he was studying for the most important exam of his life. After they parted ways, Marcus reflected on how strange it felt to be seen as someone worth emulating. 6 months earlier, he had been invisible in his own life. Now people sought his advice and perspective. That evening, Sarah brought up a topic they had been dancing around for weeks. "I've been thinking about us," she said as they walked through the park where they had shared so many morning runs. Marcus felt a familiar flutter of anxiety, but it was different now. Instead of the paralyzing fear that would have once consumed him, it was simply awareness that an important conversation was beginning. "What about us? I love who you are now, but more than that, I love who you're becoming. I can see that your transformation isn't finished. It's not something you achieved and now you're done. It's a way of life." Marcus nodded. "I never want to go back to who I was. But I also don't want to pretend I'm finished becoming who I'm supposed to be." "That's what I love about you," Sarah said, stopping to face him. "You're not trying to arrive at some final version of yourself. You're committed to the process of growth." They stood there in the lamplight, two people who had found in each other not completion, but companionship for the journey of becoming their best selves. "I want to build something with you," Sarah continued. "Not because I need you to complete me, but because I want to see what we can create together when we're both committed to growing. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest. This was the kind of relationship he had never believed possible for himself. A partnership based on mutual growth rather than mutual need, on shared strength rather than complementary weaknesses. I want that too, he said simply. As they walked home hand in hand, Marcus realized that his transformation had reached a new phase. The first phase had been about building himself up from nothing. This phase would be about learning to build something meaningful with another person while maintaining his individual growth. The man who had once apologized for existing was learning to create a life worth living. 2 years after that first morning in the bathroom mirror, Marcus Chen faced the greatest test of his transformation. Sarah had been accepted into a prestigious fellowship program at Johns Hopkins, an opportunity that would advance her career by a decade, but would require them to spend 18 months apart. The old Marcus would have panicked. He would have begged her not to go, made the conversation about his fears of abandonment, or worse, encouraged her to sacrifice her dreams to ease his anxiety. The man standing in their shared apartment kitchen, however, understood that love sometimes meant supporting decisions that caused personal discomfort. "This is incredible, Sarah," he said, reading the acceptance letter over her shoulder. "Johns Hopkins doesn't accept many people into this program. Marcus, we need to talk about what this means for us. It means you're going to Baltimore for 18 months to study under some of the best cardiac surgeons in the world," he replied calmly. "It means your career is about to accelerate in ways we've only dreamed about." Sarah turned in his arms, searching his face for signs of the reaction she expected. "And it means we'll be apart for 1.5 years.
Yes, it does. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable.
It was the silence of two people processing important information, not the silence of someone waiting for the other to break. 2 years ago, if someone had told me my girlfriend got accepted to a program across the country, I would have made it about me, Marcus said finally. I would have focused on my fear instead of her opportunity. I would have tried to make her feel guilty for pursuing her dreams. And now? Now I understand that supporting your growth is how I show love. And I trust that what we've built together is strong enough to survive 18 months of long-distance relationship. Sarah studied his face, looking for cracks in the facade, for signs of hidden resentment or suppressed fear. She found none. What she saw was genuine pride mixed with the natural sadness of separation. "You're not going to ask me to stay? Would you respect me if I did?" The question hung in the air between them. Sarah realized that one of the things she loved most about Marcus was his refusal to use emotional manipulation to get what he wanted, even when he was afraid, even when he was facing something difficult. He chose to act from strength rather than weakness. "No," she said quietly, "I wouldn't." "Then you have your answer." That night they lay in bed talking about the practical aspects of her departure, how often they would visit each other, how they would maintain emotional intimacy across distance, how they would handle the challenges that would inevitably arise. "I'm scared," Sarah admitted in the darkness. "Of the program? Long-distance relationships are hard. What if we grow apart? What if I change in ways that make me incompatible with who you're becoming?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "Those are real risks," he said finally. "But the alternative is asking you to compromise your professional development to ease our relationship anxiety. That's not love. That's fear disguised as love. So what do? We commit to growing together, even when we're apart. We stay curious about who the other person is becoming instead of trying to freeze them in who they are now. And we trust that two people committed to becoming their best selves will find ways to build something beautiful together." The conversation revealed how much Marcus had internalized the lessons of his transformation. He wasn't just stronger now, he was wiser. He understood the difference between security and control, between love and possession. 3 months later, Marcus stood in an airport watching Sarah walk toward the security checkpoint. The old version of himself would have been devastated, convinced that her leaving meant their relationship was over. This version felt sad about the separation, but confident about their future. "Call me when you land," he said, kissing her goodbye. "Every day," she promised. "Only if you want to. Don't make it an obligation. Make it a joy." As her plane taxied away, Marcus felt the familiar sensation of being tested. His transformation had prepared him for many challenges, but this was different. This was about maintaining his growth trajectory while the person who had witnessed and supported much of it was 3,000 miles away. The first month was harder than he expected, not because he doubted their relationship, but because Sarah had become such an integral part of his daily routine. Their morning runs, their evening conversations, their shared commitment to mutual growth, all of it had to be restructured. Marcus could have wallowed in loneliness. Instead, he chose to use the time to accelerate his personal development. He enrolled in evening MBA courses. He increased his training intensity at the gym. He began volunteering at a local mentoring program for at-risk youth. The mentoring program became particularly meaningful. Marcus was assigned to work with teenagers who reminded him of his former self. Young people who had internalized the belief that they were powerless to change their circumstances. His first mentee was a 16-year-old named David, whose father had abandoned the family and whose mother worked 3 jobs to make ends meet. David was brilliant but had terrible grades, not because he couldn't do the work, but because he had convinced himself that academic success was for other kinds of people. "Why should I try?" David asked during their first meeting. "Even if I get good grades, I can't afford college. Even if I could afford college, people like me don't succeed in professional careers." Marcus recognized the voice of his former self in David's words. The voice that said, "Don't try because you'll probably fail anyway." The voice that chose the certainty of guaranteed failure over the uncertainty of possible success. "Tell me about a time when you did something you didn't think you could do," Marcus said. "I don't know what you mean. Something physical maybe. A sport or an activity where you started out terrible but got better with practice." David thought for a moment. "Basketball, I guess. When I was 12, I couldn't even make a free throw. But I practiced every day after school for 6 months and made the middle school team." What changed between not being able to make a free throw and making the team? "I practiced." "Right. Did you believe you would make the team when you started practicing?" "No. So you practiced without believing it would work." David paused, beginning to see where the conversation was headed. "I guess so. Academic success works the same way. You don't have to believe you'll succeed before you start trying. You just have to start trying and let the results build your confidence." Over the following months, Marcus watched David transform the same way he had transformed. Not through dramatic revelation, but through small, consistent choices. Showing up to study sessions even when he didn't want to. Asking for help instead of pretending to understand. Choosing to see poor grades as information rather than judgment. By the end of the school year, David had raised his GPA from 1.8 to 3.2. More importantly, he had developed what Marcus called earned confidence, the quiet certainty that comes from proving to yourself that you can improve through effort. "You know what's weird?" David said during one of their last sessions. "I used to think confidence meant believing you were already good at something. But real confidence is believing you can get good at something." Marcus smiled, recognizing his own journey in David's words. "What are you going to do with that knowledge?" "Apply to college. Maybe not Harvard or anything, but somewhere I can keep growing." Marcus's work with David and other mentees taught him something important about his own transformation. The strength he had built wasn't just for his own benefit. It was a resource he could use to help others find their own path to growth. Meanwhile, his relationship with Sarah was evolving in unexpected ways. The physical distance had forced them to develop deeper emotional intimacy. Their nightly phone calls became explorations of ideas, dreams, and challenges that they might have taken for granted in person. "I've been thinking about what you said before I left," Sarah told him during one of their calls. "About how supporting my growth was how you showed love. What about it? I'm realizing that I'm learning the same lesson here. The surgeons I'm studying under, they don't just teach technique. They teach a way of thinking about challenge and growth. One of them told me that the mark of a great surgeon isn't that they never make mistakes, but that they learn from every mistake and become better because of them." That sounds familiar. It made me think about you, about your transformation. You didn't become strong by avoiding challenges. You became strong by facing challenges and learning from them. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Is there something specific you're working through?" "There's a procedure I've been struggling with. Aortic valve replacement. It's technically demanding, and I've been making small errors that don't affect patient outcomes but show that I'm not where I need to be yet." "What does your instinct tell you to do?" "Part of me wants to focus on easier procedures until I feel more confident." But that's the old me thinking. The new me knows that I need to practice the difficult procedure more, not less. "What would Marcus from 2 years ago have told you to do?" Sarah laughed. Marcus from 2 years ago would have told me to do whatever felt safest. He would have been so worried about me failing that he would have encouraged me to avoid risk. And what am I telling you now? You're not telling me anything. You're asking questions that help me find my own answer, which is that growth happens at the edge of competence. If I'm comfortable with what I'm doing, I'm not learning. These conversations revealed how much both of them had internalized the principles of intentional growth. They weren't just applying these principles to their individual lives, they were learning to support each other's application of these principles. 6 months into their separation, Marcus faced a professional challenge that tested everything he had learned about leadership and self-advocacy. His company was acquired by a larger corporation, and the new management brought their own team of executives. Marcus's position was eliminated, along with those of several colleagues. The old Marcus would have seen this as confirmation of his worthlessness. He would have panicked about money, blamed himself for not seeing it coming, and probably taken the first job offer he received regardless of whether it was a good fit. This Marcus took a different approach. He spent the first week processing the emotional impact of the layoff without making any major decisions. He acknowledged his disappointment and anxiety without letting those emotions drive his behavior. He used his emergency fund, another product of his disciplined lifestyle, to buy himself time to make thoughtful choices. "I'm sorry this happened," Sarah said during their call the night after he received the news. "Are you okay? I'm disappointed but not devastated. I'm concerned but not panicked. What's your plan?" "I don't have one yet. I'm giving myself 2 weeks to explore options before committing to any particular direction." That's very Marcus of you. What do you mean? You're treating this like a problem to be solved rather than a catastrophe to be survived. You're staying calm enough to think strategically. Marcus spent the following days networking with former colleagues, researching potential employers, and considering whether this might be an opportunity to make a bigger career change than he would have considered otherwise. 3 different companies offered him positions similar to the one he had lost. Each offered comparable salary and benefits. The old Marcus would have accepted whichever offer came first, grateful that someone was willing to hire him. Instead, Marcus interviewed at each company not just as a candidate, but as someone evaluating whether they would be a good fit for his continued growth. He asked about their culture, their approach to employee development, their plans for future expansion. One company stood out. Technova was smaller than his previous employer but growing rapidly. During his interview with their CEO, Elena Rodriguez, Marcus found himself in the kind of conversation he had learned to recognize as significant. "Tell me about a time when you had to advocate for yourself professionally," Elena said. Marcus told her about the Peterson Project incident, but more importantly, he told her about what he had learned from it. "The easy lesson would have been that I needed to be more aggressive about taking credit," he said. "But the deeper lesson was that I needed to be more confident about the value I was creating. When you know you're adding real value, advocating for yourself becomes about integrity, not ego." Elena leaned forward. "What's the difference? When you're advocating from ego, you're trying to convince other people you're valuable. When you're advocating from integrity, you're ensuring that value is acknowledged and utilized appropriately." The conversation continued for 2 hours. Elena didn't just ask about Marcus's experience. She asked about his approach to challenges, his philosophy of growth, his vision for his career development. "We're not just hiring someone to fill a position," she explained. "We're looking for someone who can grow with the company and help build something significant." Marcus recognized this as the kind of opportunity he would have been too intimidated to pursue 2 years earlier. Technova was offering him a chance to help build something from the ground up, to take on responsibilities that would stretch his capabilities and accelerate his development. "I'm interested," he told Elena, "but I need to ask you something. I'm committed to continuous growth, both professionally and personally. I need to know that this company supports that kind of intentional development. What does that look like practically?" "It means I'm going to ask for feedback regularly, not just during formal reviews. It means I'm going to propose new ideas and initiatives, even if they fall outside my specific job description. It means I'm going to challenge myself and probably make mistakes while I'm learning." Elena smiled. "That's exactly what we're looking for." Marcus accepted the position with Technova, recognizing it as another step in his ongoing transformation. But the real test came 3 weeks later, when Sarah called with unexpected news. "The fellowship has been extended," she said, a voice carrying a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "They want me to stay an additional year to work on a research project that could lead to a permanent position here." Marcus felt the familiar sensation of being tested. This was longer than they had planned. This was Sarah potentially building a life in Baltimore that didn't include him. "How do you feel about it?" he asked. "Professionally, it's a dream opportunity. Personally, I'm terrified of what it means for us." "Tell me about the professional aspects first." Sarah described the research project, the potential for publication, the mentorship she would receive, the doors it could open in her career. As she spoke, Marcus could hear the passion in her voice, the excitement about the work itself. "This could establish you as a researcher in addition to a clinician," he said when she finished. "Yes, and research has always been one of your long-term goals." "Yes. So the question isn't whether this is a good opportunity. The question is whether we can navigate the additional year apart. Can we?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, not because he was unsure of his answer, but because he wanted to give the question the consideration it deserved. "I think we can," he said finally. "But I think it requires a different conversation about our future. If you're potentially building a career in Baltimore, we need to talk about what that means for where we end up long term. Are you willing to move to Baltimore?"
I'm willing to consider it.
"My new position gives me flexibility to work remotely part of the time, and Technova is expanding. There might be opportunities to help them establish an East Coast presence." They spent the next several weeks having the kinds of conversations that define the trajectory of a relationship, not just about logistics and geography, but about their individual visions for their lives and how those visions could align or complement each other. "I want to be clear about something," Marcus said during one of these conversations. "I'm not willing to sacrifice my growth for the relationship, and I don't want you to sacrifice your growth either, but I am willing to adapt my path to create space for our growth together." What's the difference? Sacrifice implies giving up something important. Adaptation means finding creative ways to pursue what's important while also building something together. These conversations revealed how much both of them had learned about the difference between compromise and collaboration. Compromise often involved both parties giving up things they wanted. Collaboration involved finding ways for both parties to get what they wanted, even if it looked different than they had originally imagined. Sarah decided to accept the extended fellowship. Marcus began exploring opportunities to help Technova expand to the East Coast. They committed to visiting each other more frequently and began planning for a future that incorporated both of their professional ambitions. 6 months later, Marcus found himself back in front of a bathroom mirror, but this time it was in a hotel room in Baltimore. He was visiting Sarah for a long weekend, and they had spent the day exploring neighborhoods where they might eventually live together. The man in the mirror looked confident and content in a way that still surprised him sometimes. The transformation that had begun with a single decision to stop accepting his own weakness had evolved into a way of life characterized by intentional growth and purposeful action. His phone buzzed with a text from David, his former mentee, who was now finishing his first semester at a state university where he had earned a partial academic scholarship. "Got my grades today," the message read. 3.7 GPA. "Remember when I thought college was for other kinds of people? Turns out I am other kinds of people now." Marcus smiled, remembering his own journey from believing he was powerless to understanding that power was something he could develop. David's success felt like proof that transformation was contagious, that strength could be taught and learned and passed on. Another message came in. This one from James, his former colleague who had tried to steal credit for the Peterson project. James had started his own consulting firm and was asking Marcus for advice about hiring practices. "I want to build a company culture that supports growth rather than just rewarding existing talent," James wrote. "You've become the person I think about when I imagine what that looks like." Marcus realized that his transformation had created ripple effects he was only beginning to understand. People who had known him during his weak phase and witnessed his development were applying lessons from his journey to their own lives. He had become inadvertently but meaningfully influential. The thought would have terrified the old Marcus. The responsibility of being seen as an example, of having other people's growth partially dependent on his continued development, would have paralyzed him with anxiety about disappointing people. This Marcus felt energized by the responsibility. He understood that influence was a natural byproduct of authentic growth, and that the best way to help others develop was to continue developing himself. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror one more time, but this time he saw something different. Not just a man who had overcome his weaknesses, but a man who had learned to transform challenge into strength, setback into opportunity, individual growth into collective influence. The journey was far from over. Sarah would finish her fellowship in 8 months, and they would begin building a life together in whatever city made the most sense for both their careers. Technova was expanding rapidly, creating new challenges and opportunities. David and other young people were seeking mentorship and guidance. But Marcus no longer worried about his ability to handle whatever came next. He had learned the fundamental truth that had made all other learning possible. Strength wasn't something you either possessed or lacked. It was something you could build through disciplined practice and courageous action. The weak man who had once apologized for existing had been replaced by someone who understood that existence was not something to apologize for, but something to make meaningful through continuous growth and service to others. As he prepared for bed in that Baltimore hotel room, Marcus felt grateful for the journey that had brought him to this point and excited about the journey that lay ahead. The transformation was complete, but the man who had been transformed understood that completion was not an ending, but a foundation for whatever he chose to build next. 5 years after Marcus Chen first chose courage over comfort in that conference room, he stood before 200 executives at the annual Technova Leadership Summit. As the company's newly appointed Vice President of Strategic Development, he was delivering the keynote address on organizational transformation. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who had once been unable to speak up in a meeting of 12 colleagues was now responsible for guiding the strategic direction of a company with over 3,000 employees across 4 countries. Transformation, Marcus began, his voice carrying easily across the auditorium, is not an event. It's a discipline. In the front row sat Sarah, now Dr. Sarah Mitchell Chen, wearing her wedding ring and a smile that reflected 5 years of shared growth. Beside her sat Elena Rodriguez, Technova's CEO, who had taken a chance on Marcus during his career transition and had since watched him evolve into one of the company's most valuable strategic thinkers. 5 years ago, I was a different person working at a different company, and I made a choice that changed everything. But the choice wasn't to become strong overnight. The choice was to become someone who chose strength over weakness every day, even when strength was more difficult, more uncomfortable, and more uncertain than weakness. Marcus scanned the audience, seeing faces that reflected his own journey. Some were eager and confident, ready to tackle any challenge. Others looked skeptical or intimidated, perhaps recognizing aspects of their former selves in his story. The question isn't whether you have the capability to transform. The question is whether you have the courage to begin and the discipline to continue.
After his presentation, Marcus was approached by a young executive named Jennifer Walsh.
She reminded him of himself 5 years earlier, brilliant but hesitant, capable but lacking confidence in her own capabilities. Chen, I wonder if I could ask you about something. I've been with the company for 3 years, and I consistently receive positive feedback, but I feel like I'm not living up to my potential. I know I could contribute more, but I'm afraid of overstepping or making mistakes that might hurt my career. Marcus recognized the familiar tension between ambition and fear, between knowing what was possible and believing it was possible for you specifically. Tell me about the last time you had an idea that you thought could improve something but didn't act on it. Jennifer described a process improvement she had identified that could save the company significant time and resources, but which would require convincing multiple department heads to change their established procedures. What stopped you from proposing it? What if they think it's a bad idea? What if I'm missing something obvious? What if I come across as presumptuous? And what happens if you don't propose it? Nothing changes. The inefficiency continues. So the choice is between risking temporary embarrassment and guaranteeing continued problems. Jennifer paused, seeing the choice framed differently than she had been considering it. When you put it that way, it seems obvious. Most growth choices seem obvious in retrospect. The difficulty is making them feel obvious in the moment when fear is loudest. Marcus spent 30 minutes with Jennifer, not giving her advice about her specific situation, but helping her develop a framework for making choices from strength rather than fear. When they parted, she had committed to preparing a proposal for her process improvement and presenting it to her manager within the week. Remember, Marcus told her as they shook hands, confidence isn't believing you'll succeed. Confidence is believing you can handle whatever happens. That evening, Marcus and Sarah drove home to the suburban Baltimore house they had bought 18 months earlier. Sarah's fellowship had led to a permanent research position at Johns Hopkins, and Marcus had successfully established Technova's East Coast operations. Their home reflected the life they had built together, a blend of ambition and contentment, growth and stability. Sarah's medical journals shared shelf space with Marcus's business books. The garage had been converted into a home gym where they trained together most mornings. The basement office functioned as Sarah's research workspace and Marcus's strategic planning retreat. "How did the presentation go?" Sarah asked as they prepared dinner together. "Good, I think. Afterward, I talked with a young executive who reminded me of myself 5 years ago. Scared but capable." "Exactly. It's interesting how clearly you can see the path forward when you're helping someone else, but how murky it seems when you're walking it yourself. That's why mentoring is so valuable. You get to be the person you needed when you were struggling." As they ate, Marcus reflected on how different this conversation was from ones they might have had during his transformation period. Then, discussions about his professional development had carried undertones of anxiety and self-doubt. Now, they were simply part of the natural rhythm of two people committed to continuous growth. "I got some interesting news today," Sarah said, serving herself more salad. "The research project I've been leading caught the attention of the National Institutes of Health. They want me to head up a multi-site study on cardiac intervention techniques." "That's incredible. What would that involve?" "Coordinating research across 8 major hospitals, managing a team of 30 researchers, and potentially influencing treatment protocols nationally." Marcus set down his fork, recognizing this as one of those conversations that could define the next phase of their lives together. "How do you feel about it?" "Excited and terrified in equal measure. It's the kind of opportunity that could establish my career for the next 2 decades. But it's also a level of responsibility I've never had before." "What does your instinct tell you?" "That I should say yes. That this is exactly the kind of challenge that will force me to grow into the researcher and leader I want to become." "Then what's creating the hesitation?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "I think I'm still sometimes surprised when people see capabilities in me that I haven't fully proven to myself yet." Marcus smiled, recognizing his wife's version of the same pattern he had overcome. "Do you remember what you told me before I took the position at Technova? That growth happens at the edge of competence? And where is your competence edge right now? Managing large-scale multi-site research projects? So this opportunity is perfectly positioned to accelerate your development?" "You're right. I knew that before I told you about it. I think I just wanted to hear myself think through it out loud." This was one of the gifts their relationship had developed over 5 years of intentional growth. They had become skilled at helping each other think clearly without making decisions for each other. They had learned to be supportive without being protective, encouraging without being pushy. "There's another aspect to consider," Sarah continued. "If I take this position, I'll be traveling more frequently, working longer hours during project launches, and carrying more stress. How do you think that will affect us?" "I don't know. We've built a good rhythm together. I don't want to disrupt that unnecessarily." Marcus considered this carefully. The old version of himself might have used Sarah's concern about work-life balance as an excuse to discourage her from pursuing the opportunity. He might have framed his fear of change as concern for their relationship stability. "I think we've learned that our relationship gets stronger when we both pursue growth, even when that growth creates temporary challenges," he said finally. "The question isn't whether this will disrupt our rhythm. The question is whether we can adapt our rhythm to support your development. And do you think we can?" "I think we have a 5-year track record of figuring out how to build a life together while both pursuing individual growth. I don't see why this would be different." Sarah accepted the NIH position 3 weeks later. The transition required them to renegotiate aspects of their domestic life, their travel schedules, and their communication patterns. But it also provided Marcus with an opportunity to apply everything he had learned about supporting someone else's growth while maintaining his own trajectory. 6 months into Sarah's new role, Marcus received a call from David, his former mentee, now a senior at the state university where he had earned that partial scholarship. "Marcus, I hope it's okay to call you. I'm facing a decision, and I keep thinking about things you taught me when I was in high school." "Of course. What's the situation?" "I've been accepted to law school, but I've also been offered a position at a tech startup. The startup job pays well immediately, but law school is a bigger long-term investment. The old me would probably take the immediate money because it feels safer." Marcus listened as David described both opportunities, hearing echoes of conversations he'd had with Sarah about her NIH position, with Jennifer about her process improvement proposal, with himself about every major decision of the past 5 years. "What does your growth edge tell you?" Marcus asked. "Law school. The startup job would be comfortable. I already understand business operations from my undergraduate work. Law school would challenge me to develop new capabilities and think about problems differently. And what's making that choice feel difficult? 3 more years of school, 3 more years of debt, 3 more years of uncertainty about whether I'm good enough to succeed as a lawyer. David, do you remember what you told me during our last mentoring session 4 years ago? Not exactly. You said that real confidence was believing you could get good at something, not believing you were already good at it. There was a long pause on the phone. I said that? You did. And it was true then, and it's true now. So you think I should go to law school? I think you should make the choice that's most likely to accelerate your growth, even if it's also the choice that involves more uncertainty. David chose law school. Jennifer successfully implemented her process improvement and was promoted to department head. Sarah's multi-site research study was approved for full funding and expanded to include international collaborators. Marcus watched these developments with the satisfaction of someone who understood that his own transformation had created ripple effects that were now creating their own ripple effects. The strength he had built in himself was now part of a larger ecosystem of growth and development that extended far beyond his individual life. 2 years later, at the age of 34, Marcus was offered the position of Chief Operating Officer at Technova. The company had grown from 3,000 to 8,000 employees, expanding into new markets and developing innovative technologies that were reshaping their industry. I need someone who can think strategically about organizational development, Elena told him during the conversation where she offered him the position. Someone who understands that a company's growth is ultimately dependent on its people's growth. Marcus accepted the position, but not without carefully considering what it would mean for the life he and Sarah had built together. The COO role would require international travel, longer hours during critical periods, and a level of responsibility that would affect how he approached every other aspect of his life. Are you sure you want this? Sarah asked the night before he planned to accept the offer. You've already achieved more than most people dream of. You don't have anything to prove to anyone. This isn't about proving anything, Marcus replied. This is about using what I've learned to create an environment where other people can grow the way I've grown. What do you mean? I want to build a company culture that actively supports transformation, where people like Jennifer don't have to overcome organizational resistance to implement good ideas, where people like David can develop their capabilities without fearing that mistakes will end their careers. Sarah studied his face in the lamplight of their bedroom. You're talking about scaling the mentoring you've been doing. Exactly. Instead of helping one person at a time discover their potential, I want to help create systems that help hundreds of people discover their potential. That's a big responsibility. It's the right kind of responsibility. Marcus's first year as COO was characterized by what he called intentional disruption. He identified organizational practices that prioritized short-term comfort over long-term growth and systematically replaced them with practices that encouraged continuous development. He implemented mentoring programs that paired senior employees with junior employees, not just for knowledge transfer but for mutual growth. He restructured performance reviews to focus on development planning rather than evaluation. He created innovation labs where employees could propose and test new ideas without fear of career repercussions if their experiments failed. The goal, he explained to the senior leadership team, is to create an environment where people's default choice is growth rather than safety. The changes weren't universally popular. Some employees preferred the predictability of the old systems. Some managers resented having their authority structures questioned. Some shareholders worried about short-term productivity disruptions. But Marcus had learned enough about leadership to understand that transformation always involves resistance, and that resistance was information, not opposition to be suppressed. Change is uncomfortable. He told the management team during one particularly difficult quarter, "Our job isn't to eliminate the discomfort. Our job is to help people become comfortable with discomfort because that's where growth happens." By the end of his second year as COO, Technova's employee satisfaction scores had reached industry-leading levels. More importantly, the company's innovation metrics, new product development, process improvements, problem-solving capabilities, had improved dramatically. Marcus had successfully scaled the principles of individual transformation to organizational transformation. On a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 7 years after he first chose to speak up in that conference room about the Peterson project, Marcus stood in his office bathroom, adjusting his tie before a board meeting where he would present Technova's annual strategic plan. The man in the mirror looked confident and purposeful in a way that would have been unrecognizable to his former self, but more than that, he looked peaceful. He had learned the difference between striving and arriving. between building and maintaining, between becoming and being. His phone buzzed with a text message from Jennifer, now a vice president at Technova's London office, managing the company's European expansion. Presenting to the European board today, the message read, "Remembered something you told me. Confidence isn't believing you'll succeed. It's believing you can handle whatever happens. Thanks for helping me believe I could get good at this." Another message came in from David, now a second-year law student who had been selected for a prestigious internship at a civil rights organization. "Using everything you taught me about choosing strength over fear, taking on cases that scare me because that's where the learning happens." A third message arrived from Sarah, who was at the NIH headquarters in Washington presenting her research findings to a congressional committee on healthcare policy. "5 years ago, you supported my fellowship decision even though it meant 18 months apart. That decision led to this moment. Thank you for loving my growth even when it was inconvenient." Marcus read these messages and understood that his transformation had become part of something larger than himself. The choice he had made 7 years ago to stop accepting his own weakness had created a chain reaction of growth, influence, and positive change that extended far beyond what he could have imagined when he was just trying to find the courage to speak up in a meeting. As he walked toward the boardroom where he would present strategic plans that could affect thousands of employees and millions of customers, Marcus reflected on the fundamental truth that had made everything else possible. Transformation wasn't about becoming someone different. It was about becoming someone authentic. It wasn't about developing a false confidence or an artificial strength. It was about discovering the confidence and strength that had always been possible, but had been buried under years of choosing fear over courage, comfort over growth, safety over possibility. The weak man who had once apologized for existing had learned that existence was not something to apologize for, but something to make meaningful through continuous growth and service to others. The frightened man who had once avoided challenges had learned that challenges were not obstacles to happiness, but opportunities for development. The isolated man who had once felt powerless had learned that true power came not from controlling others, but from inspiring others to discover their own strength. In the boardroom, Marcus delivered his presentation with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to trust his own judgment, accept his own authority, and use his influence responsibly. The strategic plan he presented wasn't just about company growth. It was about creating an organization that could serve as a catalyst for human development. After the meeting, Elena approached him with news that would represent the next phase of his journey. "The board wants to discuss succession planning," she said. "They're asking me to consider who could eventually take over as CEO. What did you tell them? That I've been watching someone transform himself in this company for the past 5 years, and that person might be ready for a conversation about what he wants to do with the next 10 years of his career." Marcus felt the familiar sensation of being offered a challenge that would stretch his capabilities and accelerate his development. The old version of himself would have been paralyzed by the magnitude of the responsibility. This version felt energized by the opportunity to create even more positive impact. "I'm interested in that conversation," he said simply. That evening, Marcus and Sarah sat on the back porch of their Baltimore home, watching the sunset and talking about the future. Sarah's NIH research had led to breakthrough treatments that were already saving lives. Marcus's work at Technova had created an organizational culture that was being studied and replicated by other companies. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't spoken up about the Peterson project?" Sarah asked. Marcus considered the question seriously. "I think I would have eventually found another moment to choose courage over fear. Maybe it would have taken longer, maybe the path would have been different, but I think I was reaching a point where staying weak was more painful than risking strength." "What makes you say that?" "Because transformation isn't usually a response to inspiration. It's usually a response to the recognition that the status quo has become unacceptable, and your status quo had become unacceptable. Living as a victim of my own fear had become unacceptable. Watching other people get credit for my work had become unacceptable. Being in a relationship where I was chosen out of pity rather than admiration had become unacceptable." Sarah turned to face him. "Is that how you saw our early relationship? That I was with you out of pity?" "Not consciously, but I didn't understand then what I understand now about the difference between being needed and being valued. I thought love meant finding someone who needed you. I learned that love means finding someone who chooses you. And you think I choose you? I know you do. Every day. And I know why you choose me. And it's not because you feel sorry for me or because you need me to complete you. You choose me because you like who I am and who I'm becoming. That's exactly right." As they sat in comfortable silence, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 7 years of choosing growth over comfort, courage over fear, possibility over certainty. 7 years of building strength not through domination but through discipline. 7 years of learning that true confidence came not from believing you were better than others, but from knowing you could become better than your former self. The transformation was complete, but the man who had been transformed understood that completion was not an ending, but a foundation. A foundation for whatever he chose to build next, whoever he chose to help next, however he chose to use the strength he had spent 7 years developing. Marcus Chen had learned the most important truth of human development, that the man who destroys his weak self through disciplined growth can never be destroyed by others, because he has become unshakable from within, not through arrogance or hardness, but through the quiet confidence that comes from knowing that whatever challenges arise, he has the capability to meet them with grace, wisdom, and strength. The weak man was gone, replaced not by someone hard or cold, but by someone authentically powerful, someone who used strength to serve rather than dominate, to build rather than destroy, to inspire rather than intimidate. Someone who understood that the greatest victory was not over others, but over the limitations that had once seemed permanent, the fears that had once seemed insurmountable, the weaknesses that had once seemed defining. Someone who had learned that transformation was not a destination, but a way of traveling through life with purpose, courage, and an unshakable commitment to becoming worthy of the influence he had earned and the trust he had been given. The journey continued, but the destination had changed. It was no longer about becoming strong enough to survive. It was about becoming strong enough to serve, to lead, to inspire others to discover their own capacity for transformation. And in that service, Marcus had found not just strength, but meaning, not just confidence, but purpose, not just success, but significance. The forge had done its work. The man who emerged was unbreakable, not because it was hard, but because he was whole.